Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly back through time, lantern light flickering, cobblestones slick from yesterday's rain, the faint odor of smoke and sweat curling through the air. You're walking into the Middle Ages, a place where washing too often isn't considered polite. It's actually suspicious. The villagers might eye you sideways if you show up with clean nails and floral soap. You'd think cleanliness would be next to godliness, but back then, it could get you branded as unholy fancy. And honestly, if you survive the smells alone, you're already a legend. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to hear where you're listening from tonight. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing beside a wooden washtub filled with lukewarm water that's already been used 3 times. A child first, then his mother, then the father. So congratulations, you're last. The phrase, "don't throw the baby out with the bathwater," suddenly makes perfect sense, because by the time it's your turn, the liquid's more like medieval soup. The logic is economical, wood's expensive, water's heavy, and soap. Well, soap's for the upper crust, not for folks who milk goats and share boots. The weirdest part? People thought washing too often could make you sick. The skin, they said, was like armor. Open the pores too much with hot water and disease would slip right in. Doctors, meaning the handful of men in long robes quoting Aristotle, warned that a bath might weaken the vital humors, and you don't want that. So, instead of lathering up, most people focused on smelling acceptable. The trick was covering, not cleaning. You'd rub rose petals on your wrists, dust your hair with herbs, or hang sweet, smelling bags under your sleeves. Nobles might soak their clothes in vinegar water to disinfect them. And if you're wondering whether that worked, historians still argue whether those perfumes helped fend off bacteria or just made everyone smell like pickles. You pass by a public bathhouse, one of the few places where people actually get properly clean. The steamy air smells of mint and mildew, laughter echoing off the tiled walls. Inside, men and women sometimes bathe together, which freaks out the church. Before long, bathhouses get condemned as dens of sin. By the late Middle Ages, many are shut down, ironically, just before the plague hits. Perfect timing. Baths weren't totally gone, though. Royals had their tubs lined with sheets, filled with warm water by servants carrying bucket after bucket. Imagine being the poor guy on bucket number 60, cursing the king's hygiene aspirations. One of the strangest rules from this era came from the court of France. Bathwater couldn't be reused for anyone of lower status. That meant if a duke soaked first, a squire couldn't use the same tub, no matter how clean it looked. Rank even dictated rinse order. Then, there were rules about how often you could bathe. In some monasteries, monks were only allowed 4 full baths a year. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and midsummer. In between, they'd wash their hands and feet as needed. You'd fit right in if you carried that policy into college. Now, imagine you're a traveling merchant crossing through town. You've got the grime of 6 days' ride on you. Your beard's a small wildlife preserve, and the next inn has a sign outside, baths available. 1 penny extra. Tempting, right? But the local priest might frown if he catches you claiming you're indulging in fleshly comfort. People were literally shamed for wanting to be clean. A few noble families even had edicts banning frequent bathing, claiming it softens the body and spirit. Still, humans being humans, not everyone stuck to the no bath vibe. Queen Isabella of Castile supposedly took a bath once a month, shocking her peers with such extravagant cleanliness. Meanwhile, in Paris, King Henry IV's court adopted the scent, over soap trend. Henry himself wore so much perfume that courtiers joked they could follow his ghost by smell alone. And here's where it gets both gross and fascinating. People turned hygiene into ritual rather than routine. Instead of washing, they'd purify. They'd burn sage, sprinkle holy water, or rub themselves with cloth dipped in wine. If your body couldn't be clean, at least your soul could be. Picture this. You're at a medieval banquet, seated between two knights who haven't met a bar of soap in years. The roasted boar's steaming, music's playing, and there's one shared bowl of water at the end of the table. The finger bowl. Everyone dips their greasy hands into it between courses. By dessert, that water's murkier than the local moat. But the gesture's what counts. It's a symbol of manners, not sanitation. Fun fact, the word soap comes from Mount Sapo in Rome, where people found that ashes mixed with animal fat made a decent cleanser. Medieval soap was a coarse grey lump, smelling faintly of death and sheep. The English had lye soap, made with ashes and rainwater. It cleaned, sure, but it also peeled off a few layers of skin for good measure. One fringe hygiene trend came from the Crusaders. After returning from the East, they brought back exotic scents, musk, amber, and jasmine. The nobles loved them so much that perfumers became rock stars of the court. Cities like Venice even had guilds for scent masters. One bizarre rule: only widows could sell perfumes, since they were considered safe from temptation. Apparently, being married disqualified you from making others smell nice. Historians still argue whether the medieval no bathing stereotype is exaggerated. Some say peasants did wash in rivers or lakes when weather allowed, even if they didn't call it bathing. Others insist that dirt was worn like a badge of modesty. Both can be true. Context was everything. In London, where the Thames doubled as a toilet, you probably didn't want to dive in anyway. By the 14th century, plague paranoia sealed the deal. Doctors warned that bathing opened the pores to corruption. So people sealed themselves in layers of clothing, sweating out the sickness instead of washing it off. One physician even recommended wiping the body with vinegar-soaked cloth daily, instead of risking one's health in treacherous water. You can almost smell the optimism. As the candle burns low, you think about how rules like these came from fear. Fear of disease, of sin, of standing out. In a world without germ theory, superstition became science. And while their noses might have suffered, their logic wasn't completely off. Stagnant water did spread illness. Bathhouses were sometimes unsanitary. The problem was mistaking cause for effect. You picture yourself walking home under torchlight. Layers of wool scratching your neck, the air dense with humanity. You pass the baker's hut, the farrier's forge, the tanner's pit, each one a different flavor of medieval stink. Yet somehow, life goes on. People laugh, flirt, drink, dream. Hygiene might be optional, but hope's apparently waterproof. You reach your tiny room at the inn, unlace your boots, and sit beside a wash basin. A few inches of cool water wait for you. You dip your hands in, rubbing away the day's grime. It's quiet, just the creak of the wooden floor and the flicker of your candle. For a moment, you wonder what it would feel like to live without fear of washing, to smell like nothing but yourself. Then again, maybe mystery has its charm. After all, who needs soap when you've got legend? The sun dips low, and the shadows stretch long across the cobbled lanes. The air smells faintly of peat smoke and old oil. You're still wandering the same medieval town, same dirt under your boots, same clamour of bells from the church tower. But now those bells mean something more than the passing of hours. They tell you when to live and when to stop. You hear it, a deep, solemn toll rolling across the rooftops. That's the curfew bell, and it isn't just a bedtime suggestion. It's law. When it rings, fires must be doused, candles snuffed, and people tucked safely behind doors. Curfew comes from the French couvre-feu, literally, cover fire. It was a rule to prevent accidental blazes in cities made of wood, straw, and wishful thinking. One spark, and half the town could vanish overnight. So when you hear that bell, you act fast. You grab the iron pot from the hearth, toss a damp cloth over the embers, and murmur a small prayer that the ashes stay put. Step outside after that. Dangerous. The night is for thieves, ghosts, and those who fancy a brush with the town constable. Picture it a guard with a lantern, his armor clinking softly as he patrols the narrow streets. If he catches you wandering after the bell, you'd better have a solid excuse. Fetching a midwife, tending a fire, or chasing a lost pig. Otherwise, it's a fine or a night in the stocks. A romantic midnight stroll. Not unless your idea of romance involves splinters and public humiliation. The weirdest part, the rule was meant to save lives. Medieval towns burned like tinderboxes. London's Great Fire of 1666 came long after curfews had faded, but it proved how right those early fears were. The medievals weren't just paranoid. They were practical in their own panicky way. Still, you can imagine how suffocating it felt. The bell's final note fading, the sudden hush falling like a blanket. The only light left is from stars and the moon, and even those seem cautious. You pull your cloak tighter and think, what if you just didn't go home? Some people didn't. Bakers, for one. Bread had to rise overnight, so they got special permission to keep their ovens lit. Imagine the smell of warm loaves drifting through the silent town, a kind of rebellion baked in yeast and courage. That scent alone might have been the medieval equivalent of breaking curfew for a midnight snack. And yet, there's beauty in the rule too. The enforced quiet creates a rhythm, the whole town breathing together. By day, it's chaos carts creaking, bells ringing, chickens screaming about their existential dread. But when curfew hits, the world exhales. The only sounds are your own footsteps, maybe a dog barking in the distance. Not every place handled curfew the same way. In some English towns, like Oxford, the bell rang from the Church of St. Mary's at 9 p.m. sharp. In France, it might toll as early as 7. In Italy, depends on the season. Southern nights came later, lazier, so you could enjoy the evening air before being forced indoors. A few towns even had separate bells. One warning, one final. Miss the second. Too late, friend. Historians still argue whether curfew laws were about safety or control. Was it really about fire prevention, or about keeping people obedient? Tucked neatly into their homes where they couldn't plot rebellion. After all, fewer gatherings after dark meant fewer conspiracies, fewer lovers' trysts, fewer songs sung by the wrong crowd. The bell didn't just end your workday, it ended your freedom for the night. You lean against the wall, watching shutter after shutter close. Somewhere, a blacksmith curses as his forge cools too soon. A child cries because the night terrifies him. A couple whispers a rushed goodbye at a doorway, the bell's last echoes swallowing their voices. The sound of obedience has a strange kind of poetry, doesn't it? And still, not everyone obeyed. You'd be surprised how creative people got. Some townsfolk built secret chimneys to hide their late night firers, smoke funneled low so the watchman wouldn't see it. Others cooked by candlelight under heavy lids, muffling the glow. There's always that one neighbor roasting meat at midnight, pretending it's all incense for the saints. Of course, the church loved curfew too. Darkness was symbolic, a time for prayer, not pleasure. Monks would wake at midnight to chant matins, their voices echoing through stone halls like wind through catacombs. You, as a layperson, were supposed to stay asleep or whisper prayers if you woke. The night wasn't yours, it belonged to God. But sometimes the night rebelled. Festivals, for instance. On feast days, curfew could be lifted, and suddenly the streets came alive with torches, dancing and music that thumped against the church walls. Picture hundreds of villagers twirling under the stars, laughing, drinking, breaking every rule in the book for one glorious night. A reminder that even in a world of laws, joy finds loopholes. And then there were the nightmen, the unsung heroes, or maybe villains of the curfew hours. These were the folks who cleaned latrines, hauled refuse, and collected the dead during outbreaks. Their work began after the bell, when everyone else hid indoors. They were paid well but shunned during the day, literally touched only by moonlight. You probably wouldn't survive their shift without a strong stomach and an even stronger nose. Now imagine the psychological side of curfew. The way people grew used to fear after dark. You hear rustling in the alley. Could be rats or spirits. Doors creak, wind moans through the thatch, and your candle flickers. Suddenly every superstition you've ever heard feels real. Ghosts, witches, demons. They all thrive past curfew. The rule keeps you safe from them, or so everyone says. One fringe rule from an old Flemish town stated that anyone caught wandering or singing in the streets after the 9th bell could be whipped. Singing. Imagine humming to yourself after a long day and, bam, instant punishment. The logic. Music stirred temptation, and temptation bred sin. I guess Spotify wouldn't do well here. By the way, this curfew concept didn't fade entirely. The word still shows up centuries later. Wartime curfews, public safety lockdowns, even modern, quiet hours. The roots trace right back to those medieval bells tolling over smoky rooftops. You can almost hear their echo in every lights out rule since. As you linger near the church square, you spot a boy sprinting through the shadows, a loaf of bread tucked under his arm. The guard yells, gives chase, armor rattling. You duck behind a cart, heart thumping. The boy vanishes into an alley too narrow for pursuit. Somewhere, a dog barks triumphantly, as if cheering on the underdog. Pun intended. You exhale, the adrenaline fading. The night settles again. Above, the moon's a pale coin in the sky, its light bouncing off damp cobbles. You realize how much trust medieval people placed in rhythm and ritual. The bell wasn't just a command. It was reassurance. It told them the day was done, that their neighbors were safe, that life had structure. And yet, there's a part of you that resents it. The hush feels heavy, like a lid pressed on curiosity. You think of the baker, the lovers, the nightmen, all slipping between the rules because living quietly isn't really living. Maybe that's why, even centuries later, the phrase, after curfew, still sounds deliciously forbidden. You head toward your rented room again, feet quiet on the cobbles. A cat darts past, vanishing under a barrel. The church bell tower looms above, still humming faintly from the strike. You can almost imagine the bell ringer up there, an old man in a hood, tired arms, calloused hands, deciding when an entire town must sleep. Power in its purest, simplest form. Before you blow out your candle, you think about the irony they feared fire, but it was fire that kept them alive. Warm, cooking glowing. The rule that saved them also silenced them. In the end, every flame needs control, every night needs an edge of danger, and every rule tells you something about the people who wrote it. You crawl into your straw bed, listening as the last echo fades. The curfew bell's done its duty. The world is dark, silent, obedient. But you, still awake, still curious, let your mind wander through the night, past the guards, past the laws, past the reach of anyone's bell. You wake up to the sound of boots on cobblestone, a rooster that's way too proud of itself, and the distant clatter of church bells, reminding you that punctuality isn't optional. You stretch, pull on your wool tunic. It's itchy, of course, and step outside into the sunlight. The market's waking up too, banners fluttering, vendors shouting, and somewhere, the smell of fresh bread competes bravely against the smell of the tannery. But today, you're about to learn something dangerous. It's not about swords or sorcery, it's about clothes. Because in the Middle Ages, what you wore wasn't just fashion, it was law. Welcome to the world of sumptuary laws. The medieval version of your terms of service. Except you could literally go to jail for breaking them. You stroll through the square and instantly feel out of place. To your left, a nobleman struts in velvet, dyed the color of crushed berries. His sleeves puffed out like pastries. To your right, a merchant's wife glows in muted greens. Respectable but not too fancy. And you, poor traveller, are wearing plain brown wool. Don't even think about putting on fur trim unless you enjoy public humiliation. The reasoning behind all this? Simple. In that twisted medieval way, order must be visible. People believed the world worked best when everyone knew their place. Nobles dressed like nobles, clergy like clergy, peasants like people who couldn't afford soap, remember. It wasn't just about vanity, it was about social control. Historians still argue whether these laws actually worked, or if they were just moral theatre. Rules made to make the rich feel secure. Because really, when has anyone ever not tried to dress up just a little nicer than they should? In 1363, England's King Edward III went on a wardrobe rampage. He issued a massive decree detailing exactly what every social rank could wear, from dukes down to ploughmen. If you earned less than £40 a year, forget about silk or fancy embroidery. Even your wife couldn't wear a hood trimmed with fur, unless it was rabbit. Imagine your paycheck determining your fabric choices. It's the medieval version of a subscription plan. And the colours! Deep purple, once extracted from Mediterranean mollusks, was practically sacred. Only the upper elite could wear it. Red, made from imported cochineal dye, was for high-ranking nobles. If you were a commoner, your best bet was drab brown, grey, or a shade politely described as mud. But there were loopholes. Oh yes, medieval fashion rebels existed. One London tailor was caught secretly selling banned silk to a merchant's daughter. His punishment: a public apology and a fine large enough to bankrupt him. The girl got off lighter, just humiliation. Her gown was confiscated and paraded through town on a stick. Nothing says. Lesson learned. Like your outfit becoming a moral scarecrow. You make your way past a stall selling fabric bolts, watching the customers pick through rough linen. The merchant spots your curious eyes and leans in. Want to see something illegal? He whispers, and from under the counter, he pulls a roll of Italian velvet, rich, crimson, shimmering like wine. You can't help but touch it. Soft as sin. He grins. Don't worry, I tell them it's for a bishop. Turns out, clerics could wear almost anything, as long as it wasn't ostentatious. But that line blurred faster than ink in the rain. Bishops strutted in gold, threaded robes, while peasants were told that even a hint of silk was a temptation of pride. The hypocrisy was as thick as their tunics. Still, there's something admirable about how seriously they took the symbolism of clothing. A fur collar wasn't just cozy, it screamed, I have status. A jeweled belt could mean noble birth, or at least the ambition to fake it. Clothes were storytelling, morality play, and armor all at once. In Italy, states like Florence took sumptuary laws to Olympic levels. Officials known as Officiali del Dun, literally, officials of women, roamed the streets to inspect ladies' dresses for excess lace or forbidden pearls. Imagine being fined because your hem was too fabulous. Venetian women got particularly creative. They'd hide gems under their veils or sew gold thread into the lining where no inspector dared check. Fashion espionage at its finest. Meanwhile, in France, a few daring tailors invented detachable sleeves. Why? Because if the sleeve itself was illegal, you could lose it during an inspection. It's basically the medieval equivalent of incognito mode. Of course, not all sumptuary laws were about vanity. Some were economic. Imported dyes, silks, and furs drained local wealth, so governments tried to keep money within their borders. You could call it medieval protectionism, or fashion nationalism, if you prefer. But sometimes the rules got downright weird. In 15th century Spain, you could be fined for wearing shoes with points longer than 2 inches. These absurdly long, toed shoes, called pulaines, were a hit among nobles. Peasants called them devil's claws, and priests warned they made your soul trip into hell. King Charles V finally banned them outright. Apparently, style could literally be your downfall. You wander further, and the sensory overload hits you. The bright cloth, the glint of buckles, the noise of barter. You notice a beggar wrapped in patched rags, and beside him, a young man clearly out of his depth, wearing a tunic that's too fine for his face. The crowd stares. The unspoken rule crackles in the air: know your place, dress your rank. And yet, rebellion hums beneath it. The young man tilts his chin defiantly. For a heartbeat, you understand why people broke the rules. A new cloak wasn't just clothing, it was a taste of power. In a world where your birth decided everything, what you wore was one of the few ways to rewrite your story. A quirky detail emerges from the records of medieval Norwich. The town once fined men for wearing belts, with more than 2 silver studs. 2, apparently. The 3rd stud was the tipping point from respectable to sinful. Somewhere, a medieval dad was probably lecturing. You don't need that extra stud, Joffrey. You're not a duke. Historians still argue whether ordinary people cared much about these laws. Many scholars believe they were enforced more on paper than in practice. A bit like downloading terms and conditions you'll never read. But others say that in tightly knit towns, public shaming made them effective. People didn't fear the law as much as they feared gossip. And oh, gossip was the medieval internet. Word spread faster than fleas on a rat. Did you see Matilda wearing velvet? Velvet! Her husband's only a miller! Within a day, the whole town knew, and the local priest had something spicy for Sunday's sermon. There's also a darker side to all this. Clothing could mark not just class, but ethnicity or religion. In the 13th century, certain groups, like Jews and Muslims in Christian Europe, were forced to wear distinctive badges or colours. It wasn't about fashion anymore. It was about segregation. A chilling reminder that the same rules used to preserve order could easily be twisted into oppression. As the afternoon sun slants lower, you wander toward a tailor's workshop. Inside, the rhythm of needles and scissors fills the air. A young apprentice hums softly as he stitches a tunic's hem. You realize that every garment here carries risk. Beauty balanced on the edge of law. The tailor notices you watching. "Want a new cloak?" he asks. You nod. He pulls out rough wool, then a bolt of forbidden silk, waiting for your choice. The silk gleams temptingly in the light. You hesitate, feeling the weight of all those invisible eyes. The guards, the priests, the neighbors. Then, quietly, you point to the silk. He grins. He says, "So you want to feel alive?" As you hand over a few coins, he leans closer. "Don't worry. Everyone breaks a rule eventually." That night, when the curfew bell tolls, you're sitting in your room again. You hold the new cloak up to the candlelight, watching the colors dance. It feels scandalous warm and impossibly soft. You think of all the people who risked reputation, fortune, even safety, just to wear something beautiful. In that flickering glow, it hits you rules might shape society, but rebellion shapes history. The morning comes grey and slow, dripping through the clouds like a forgotten prayer. You wake to distant shouts. Someone arguing in the square, a crier announcing a verdict. That means one thing: there's a trial today. Not the kind with juries and lawyers and objection moments. This one's older, louder, and about as fair as a coin toss in the dark. You follow the crowd through crooked streets until you reach the churchyard. A wooden platform's been built there, fresh straw scattered to soak up whatever fate spills. On the steps, a priest reads from a parchment, and a woman kneels before him, trembling. She's accused of theft, or maybe witchcraft, or maybe both. It's hard to keep track when everything's a sin and nothing's safe. Someone whispers beside you, trial by ordeal. The words hang heavy in the air. You see, back in the early Middle Ages, when evidence was as rare as deodorant, justice worked differently. People believed that God himself decided guilt. All you had to do was survive the test. Easy, right? The woman's ordeal today, the ordeal by hot iron. A priest blesses a glowing metal rod pulled straight from the fire. She must carry it 3 paces, bare-handed. Then her burns will be wrapped and left for 3 days. If they heal clean, she's innocent. If they fester, guilty. You probably wouldn't survive the anxiety alone, let alone the burns. The crowd hushes. She lifts the iron. You smell the hiss of flesh before you even see the wince. Someone murmurs a prayer. Someone else crosses themselves. It's strangely calm, like watching fate happen in real time. Historians still argue whether these ordeals were meant to be fair or just symbolic theatre. Some say priests secretly rigged the tests, heated the iron less, cooled the water more, for those they thought innocent. Others say people truly believed divine justice was visible, tangible. Either way it worked, because everyone believed it did. And hot iron wasn't the only game in town. There was the ordeal by cold water, where the accused was tied up and tossed into a river. If you floated, you were guilty. Water rejected your sinful body. If you sank, you were innocent. Congratulations, and hopefully rescued quickly. Then there was the ordeal by combat, which sounds more cinematic than it really was. 2 people, or their chosen champions, would fight to the death, convinced that God would strengthen the arms of the righteous. A nobleman might hire a seasoned warrior to prove his innocence. A peasant. Good luck finding a volunteer who'd die for your alibi. You wander closer, trying to catch every detail. The priest's robes shimmer with embroidered gold, his face unreadable. The woman's hands are already wrapped, trembling. The crowd disperses, whispering judgments. It's strange. Everyone seems convinced justice has been served, though all anyone really saw was pain. A boy tugs your sleeve. "Did you hear about the bread ordeal?" he asks, wide-eyed. Apparently, in some monasteries, accused monks had to swallow a chunk of dry bread and cheese. If they choked, guilty. If not, absolved. The idea was that God would close a liar's throat. You can't help but imagine the poor monk gasping mid-bite and someone shouting, "See, the cheese knows!" Jokes aside, the medieval sense of justice was rooted in fear and faith mixed in equal parts. There were no forensics, no fingerprints, no reasonable doubt. There was divine intervention, and if you were lucky, a sympathetic priest who didn't heat the iron too long. As you walk back toward the square, you overhear another trial beginning. A man accused of stealing a horse. His ordeal? Combat. He stands shirtless, clutching a wooden club, sweat streaking his back. His opponent, a burly blacksmith, grins and cracks his knuckles. You think about how justice back then wasn't just about truth. It was about spectacle. Trials were events. People sold pies. Children sat on shoulders. Minstrels sang songs about famous duels. It was like watching God's will performed as public theatre. There's a record from 11th century Germany of a noblewoman accused of adultery. She demanded a trial by combat. But since women weren't supposed to fight, she was buried waist, deep in the ground, while her opponent, a knight, was forced to stand in a hole of equal depth, armed only with a stick. Equal footing, medieval style. She won, by the way. You can imagine the awkward silence that followed. One fringe tidbit that's almost too strange to believe. There were animal ordeals too. If a cow refused to give milk, people might feed it blessed bread to see if it spat out evil. And in one case from 1386, a pig was actually dressed in human clothes and tried in court for killing a child. It was sentenced to hanging. Historians still debate whether people truly saw that as justice or just ritualized guilt management. But either way, it happened. By the 13th century, things started to shift. The church grew uneasy with ordeals. Pope Innocent III eventually banned them in 1215, insisting priests shouldn't meddle in blood or fire. That left secular courts scrambling. Without God as the judge, they had to invent something new evidence. Imagine that. Logic slowly sneaking in through the back door of superstition. Still, the spirit of ordeal never really left. The phrase, trial by fire, survives to this day, used every time someone's thrown into a tough situation. You can thank those iron-wielding priests for the metaphor. You pause by a fountain, the water gleaming in the late sun. Once upon a time, that same water could have decided your guilt. You dip your fingers in, half expecting divine judgment, but all you feel is coolness. Safe, neutral, just water. There's a dark kind of wisdom in these old rules. They reveal what mattered most: purity, honor, reputation. In a world where people believed every sin echoed into eternity, even justice had to involve suffering. Pain wasn't just punishment, it was proof. As twilight deepens, you picture the townsfolk retreating home. The woman with the burned hands sits in her cottage, praying her wounds heal clean. Somewhere, a priest closes his book and stares at the embers, wondering if God truly spoke through scars. Somewhere else, a blacksmith buries his club, haunted by the face of the man he beat, for justice. The air feels heavier now, thick with the weight of faith and fear. You can almost hear the whisper of all those trials echoing through the centuries. Chains, chants, prayers, fire. You lie down that night thinking how fragile the idea of fairness really is. We call it justice. They called it divine will, but maybe both are just different names for what people hope the world should be. And as you drift towards sleep, you can almost smell the iron again, hot, holy, and human. Dawn creeps in on a puff of wood smoke and frying onions. The tavern below your rented room is already awake, clanging pans, grinding barley, shouting at chickens that refuse to cooperate. You rub your eyes, and the smell of breakfast drags you downstairs. You expect bacon, maybe eggs, but when the innkeeper catches your hopeful look, he laughs. Bacon. On a Friday. You trying to get yourself excommunicated. Welcome to the world of forbidden feasts, where eating the wrong thing on the wrong day could land you in serious spiritual hot water. In medieval Europe, the menu wasn't just about taste. It was a calendar of sins and obligations. You glance around the common room. Everyone's eating fish. Not because they love it. Half of them look like they'd rather chew their boots. But because the church said so. Fasting days are sacred, and there are a lot of them. Depending on the century and country, up to half the year could count as a meatless day. That means no red meat, no poultry, no animal fat. Fish though, fair game. Somewhere along the way, the church decided fish didn't count as flesh, perhaps because it didn't bleed the same way. One monk even argued that beavers qualified as fish since they lived in water. Spoiler, that argument actually worked. Beavers were officially considered acceptable fasting food. Historians still argue whether anyone took that seriously or just wanted an excuse to keep eating tail stew. You sit down at the table and a bowl lands in front of you. Pale broth, floating with a lonely carp eye. You poke it with your spoon. It blinks accusingly. Eat up, the innkeeper says. God's watching. The rule of fasting wasn't just about food. It was about discipline. Each bite was a reminder of obedience. The faithful learned to count days by hunger, to measure devotion by restraint. Wednesdays, Fridays, Lent, Advent, all dictated what hit your plate. But humans being humans, loopholes appeared faster than yeast dough. Monks invented what we'd now call holy hacks. They brewed beer thick enough to count as liquid bread. It had calories, flavor, and, conveniently, didn't break the fast. That's how German monks birthed the modern strong ale tradition, by getting buzzed for Jesus. In some monasteries, fish ponds were dug right beside cloisters, so friars could fast without leaving home. The Benedictines were particularly fond of eels, which slithered conveniently between categories. Technically fish, but rich enough to feel indulgent. It's said that one abbot in France raised over 1,000 eels at his abbey, claiming they helped the brothers focus on prayer. Sure, buddy. Historians still argue whether the average peasant truly followed these fasting rules. Evidence suggests they tried, at least publicly. Breaking a fast could get you fined, whipped, or made to stand outside the church holding a dead chicken in shame. But behind closed doors, people cheated. Quietly, a vegetable stew might hide a bit of bacon, and no one asked too many questions if the smell didn't travel far. There was also the butter tax. In some regions of France and Germany, because dairy was banned during Lent, the church allowed exceptions for a price. Pay the fee, get a license to enjoy butter. It's bureaucratic salvation at its tastiest. These payments funded cathedrals, monasteries, and sometimes the bishop's retirement cheese habit. You leave the tavern and wander through the town square. Market stalls brim with salted fish, peas, turnips, and bread. Everything looks faintly penitential. A baker advertises Lenten loaves, dense, dry, guaranteed to make you rethink your life choices. A fishmonger waves at you with a grin that's half pride, half fatigue. "We're rich this season," he says. "No one eats cows till Easter." Even kings had to play along. There's a story about King Henry II of England being scolded for sneaking meat on a Friday. His chaplain caught him mid-bite and forced him to fast for 40 days as penance. Imagine being grounded by your priest over a drumstick. The strangest part. Fasting wasn't always about eating less. It was about eating differently. Nobles used fasting days as a culinary challenge. Since they couldn't have meat, they invented elaborate substitutes. Fish pies shaped like swans, almond milk, cheese, and pastries that tasted like pork but weren't. The medieval kitchen was basically a religious loophole factory. You pass a group of monks distributing bowls of thin porridge to the poor. Their chant drifts over the market, rhythmic and calm. The steam rises like incense, mingling with the smell of sea salt and mud. You realize that for them, fasting isn't punishment, it's rhythm, a kind of spiritual tide that comes and goes with the seasons. But for peasants, it's just more hunger. The average medieval diet already leaned toward fasting by default. Grain, cabbage, onions. So when the church called for abstinence, most folks shrugged. It wasn't much different from every other day. It's only the rich who truly suffered when told to skip roast venison. One fringe rule you overhear a merchant brag about in parts of Scandinavia. Fasting was relaxed during long winters because God would not begrudge warmth from within. Translation: yes, you can have that stew, just call it survival. By midday, the town smells of fried herring, stewed peas, and piety. You grab a small loaf and sit near the church steps. A friar joins you, his face ruddy, his robe dusted with flour. He grins. "Lent's good for business," he says. "I make confession bread. Cheap flour, cheaper forgiveness." You laugh, and he tells you about another custom: fish feasts. When fasting was technically over, people celebrated with enormous seafood banquets, oysters, salmon, and eel pies piled high. It was like breaking the world's longest diet with a culinary explosion. And not all fasting was about food. Some monasteries had rules about speech, fasting from words. Imagine going 40 days without talking, while someone next to you chews eel soup. Silence became its own kind of feast. You watch the friar hand out bread to children and think how rules like these kept people tethered to faith, to habit, to the calendar's pulse. Even the poorest peasant knew what day it was by what they couldn't eat. Still, hunger has a way of softening piety. A widow might trade a scrap of cheese for mercy. A knight might whisper for forgiveness between bites of forbidden lamb. The line between devotion and desire was as thin as a fasting wafer. Historians still argue whether the Church's obsession with food was about health, holiness, or control. Probably all three. The body was a symbol, and keeping it disciplined meant keeping the soul on a leash. As evening sets, the tavern fills again. This time, a different smell hangs in the air. Roasted onions, something faintly meaty. You raise an eyebrow. The innkeeper winks. "The bishop's asleep," he says, "and what he doesn't know won't send us to hell." You take a cautious bite. Pork. Glorious, forbidden pork. It tastes like rebellion and salt and victory. The laughter around you grows louder, freer. For one night, at least, sin tastes like supper. You step outside later, the moon glinting on puddles, and feel oddly at peace. Maybe rules like these weren't just about denial. They were about appreciation. You can't crave what you never go without. And as your stomach settles, and the last songs fade behind you, you realize that even hunger, especially hunger, has its place in history's grand, messy feast. The next morning hums with bells and gossip. The tavern's chatter has turned from food to something far riskier: love. Not the storybook kind where knights rescue maidens and live happily ever after, but the medieval kind, full of contracts, dowries, and about as much romance as a tax audit. You step into the street and spot a wedding procession coming your way. Musicians toot on pipes, a few children throw wilted flowers, and at the center walks the bride. No white dress, no bouquet, just a simple gown in church-approved colors. She looks terrified, and you can't blame her. In this world, marriage isn't about love, it's about property, alliances, and rules. So many rules. In the Middle Ages, the marriage economy was a business dressed up as holiness. You didn't marry for butterflies. You married for cows, land, or peace between feuding neighbors. And you didn't just fall in love, you negotiated it. Fathers bartered daughters like rare commodities, sealing deals over ale and handshakes. Still, the church declared marriage sacred. What God has joined, let no man separate, said the priest. Though half the town knew some coin could buy an annulment if your partner snored too loudly or produced inconvenient hairs. You follow the procession to the churchyard. The ceremony begins outside the door, not inside, because technically, marriage was a public contract before it was a holy sacrament. Only after vows were exchanged did the couple step in for the blessing. It's like signing a mortgage before saying, "I do." The vows themselves are oddly businesslike. With this ring I thee wed, with my body I thee worship, and with all my worldly goods I thee endo. Translation: here's my property, my promise, and please don't sue me later. Historians still argue whether most medieval people truly loved their spouses. Letters suggest affection existed, sometimes even tenderness, but the system didn't prioritize it. The word, courtship, meant negotiation, not flirtation. Yet there were romantic rebels. Troubadours in southern France sang of courtly love, a poetic code where knights adored unattainable ladies from afar. They swore devotion through sonnets and sighs, idealizing women as muses rather than wives. Of course, actual wives probably rolled their eyes, while secretly enjoying the songs. The rules of courtly love were hilariously specific. A knight couldn't confess affection too soon. A lady must respond with modesty, never eagerness. And physical intimacy, only after long, noble suffering. It was basically emotional endurance training in verse. Meanwhile, common folk had simpler systems. A peasant wedding might involve jumping over a broom, exchanging garlands, or, if resources were scarce, declaring vows before witnesses without a priest. The church later tried to outlaw such clandestine marriages, but good luck policing rural romance. One quirky custom: hand fasting. Couples joined hands and pledged loyalty for a year and a day. If they still liked each other after that, they could make it permanent. It was the trial version of marriage. No refunds, but you could cancel before renewal. You wander through the market and overhear women haggling over doris. A mother boasts her daughter brings 2 cows and a patch of wheat. Another mutters that her son's bride comes with nothing but freckles. The tension is palpable. Every union shifts family fortunes. Even love needed paperwork. Marriage contracts could run pages long, listing land boundaries, debts, and even wardrobe clauses. One from 14th century Italy specified that the bride must always own at least 1 silk gown to reflect the dignity of her house. Another required the groom to build a fireplace within 2 years of union. Practical romance. In noble circles, things got political fast. Royal marriages were chess moves on a continental board. The bride's age didn't always matter. Girls as young as 12 could be betrothed if it secured an alliance. Sometimes the groom was still teething. Kings promised infants to one another like future trade deals. Love at first birth certificate, you could call it. But once married, life wasn't all strategy. There were rules about how to behave behind closed doors, though people rarely followed them. The church kept detailed handbooks on when marital intimacy was allowed, not on Sundays, feast days, Lent, Advent, or during pregnancy. That left roughly 3.5 acceptable days per year. Confessors even asked couples about their frequency of the act to ensure moderation. Too often, sin of lust. Too little, sin of neglect. Basically, no one ever got it right. One fringe tidbit: in some towns, local councils required newlyweds to sleep together immediately after the ceremony, with witnesses nearby to confirm consummation. Picture your aunt holding a candle by the bed and whispering, "Proceed, dear." Romance, medieval style. Of course, things could get grim too. Divorce wasn't allowed, but annulments were. The catch being you had to prove your marriage was invalid from the start. Grounds included impotence, pre-existing vows, or being too closely related. Considering small towns were basically extended families, that last one got used a lot. You stop by a tavern where an old man strums a lute, singing about a knight who disguised himself as a pilgrim to woo his beloved. The crowd hums along, half drunk, half dreaming. The story ends badly, of course. It always does. But for a moment, everyone looks softened by the melody. You realize love in the Middle Ages wasn't about equality or self-expression. It was about structure. Rules tried to domesticate chaos. The chaos of desire, jealousy, and heartbreak. And yet, within those walls, real tenderness managed to bloom. Historians still argue whether romantic love, as we know it, even existed back then. Some say yes. Look at the poetry of Dante and Petrarch, hearts bleeding onto parchment. Others say no, that what we call romance is a modern luxury born of freedom and choice. But when you read a 12th century note from a knight to his wife, "I long for the day your smile greets me at the gate," you can feel something timeless breathing between the ink strokes. By afternoon, the wedding feast begins. Tables groan under bread, wine, and laughter. You join the crowd, raising a cup. Someone jokes that marriages are forged by God and ruined by mothers in law, and even the priest chuckles. Then comes the ritual bedding. The bride and groom are escorted to their chamber while guests sing bawdy songs. The couple lies down, fully clothed, while witnesses offer blessings and occasionally unsolicited advice. Once the curtain closes, the real marriage begins: years of toil, children, and shared prayers that the harvest will last. You slip away before the all runs out. Outside, fireflies blink over the fields, tiny lanterns of freedom. Somewhere out there, lovers still meet in secret, unbound by contracts or curfews, whispering under trees instead of priests. You can almost hear them. Soft laughter, rustling leaves, the universal sound of defiance. Because no matter how strict the rules, people always find a way to love beyond them. And as you walk back through the moonlit village, the church bell tolls once more, as if to remind everyone. Passion may fade, but the rules never sleep. Morning mist rolls low over the cobblestones, curling like the breath of sleeping beasts. The bells toll from the courthouse tower, but today's crowd isn't here for taxes or sermons. They're here for a trial. Though the accused isn't human, it's a pig. A very guilty-looking one. You squeeze through the throng, catching snatches of gossip. Ate the baker's baby, one woman whispers. Stole a loaf first. Another corrects, as if the order of crimes matters. In front of the courthouse stands a wooden pen, and inside snorts the star of the show, a muddy sow wearing a crude rope collar. The bailiff unrolls a parchment, clears his throat, and begins reading the charges. Yes, an animal trial. In the Middle Ages, they took this sort of thing very seriously. If a beast killed, destroyed property, or even behaved suspiciously, it could face human-style prosecution. Witnesses, defense lawyers, and all. Historians still argue whether these trials were sincere or symbolic. Some think they were moral theatre. A way to show that sin contaminated all creation, not just mankind. Others suspect they were public rituals for closure, especially in tragedies like this one. But whatever the motive, the pigs, rats, and goats of Europe occasionally found themselves facing the full weight of the law. The judge arrives, a man draped in robes too fine for such an absurd occasion. He sits beneath a wooden crucifix, raises a hand for silence, and declares, "The court shall now hear the case of the Crown versus this sow, charged with murder." A murmur ripples through the crowd. Someone coughs. You can't tell if people are solemn or just trying not to laugh. The defense lawyer stands, a young cleric, sweating through his collar. His job? To argue that the pig didn't mean to kill, or that the owner's negligence should share the blame. You imagine him practicing his speech the night before. "Your Honor, my client is but a simple creature, unaware of sin or statute. This isn't fiction." Real records survive from France, Switzerland, and even England describing such scenes. In 1386, a sow was tried and publicly executed in Falaise, France, for killing a child. They even dressed it in human clothes before hanging it, to remind all creatures of their duties. You can't make that up. The trial proceeds. Witnesses step forward to swear oaths. One man insists he saw the pig act with malice aforethought. Another claims the devil possessed it. The clerk writes it all down, quill scratching solemnly, as though this were the Magna Carta of livestock justice. The jury retreats for deliberation. 10 minutes later, they return, guilty. The judge bangs a wooden mallet and declares the sentence hanging at dawn. The crowd gasps, though some are clearly more excited than horrified. As the pig is led away, you shake your head. But the oddest part, the pig's owner will likely pay for the rope, the trial, and even the hangman's lunch. Justice, it seems, has an itemized bill. And pigs weren't alone in facing judgment. In 1474, a rooster in Beisel, Switzerland, was put on trial for laying an egg, an act considered unnatural and therefore satanic. The court decided the bird had consorted with demons. It was found guilty and burned alive, egg and all. One scholar later suggested the egg might have been a double yolk mutation, but try explaining genetics to a 15th century jury. Sometimes, whole colonies of animals were charged together. Locusts, rats, or caterpillars might be summoned to court for ruining crops. Priests would read formal edicts commanding them to vacate the fields within 3 days. By the grace of God and threat of damnation. When the insects failed to comply, shocking, right? Excommunication followed. Historians still argue whether these mass trials were parodies or sincere appeals for divine intervention. Some theologians genuinely debated whether animals had souls capable of moral choice. The idea wasn't entirely absurd in their worldview. Everything in creation, they believed, could reflect sin or virtue. You follow the curious energy spilling out of the courthouse and down the street to a smaller commotion. A goat, apparently, has been put under house arrest for biting a bishop's robe. The constable explains it's awaiting judgment. You nod, as though that sentence makes perfect sense. Animal trials might sound ridiculous now, but they reveal something human, our desperate need for order in chaos. When bad things happened, child lost, crops ruined, plague spreading, someone or something had to take the blame. And sometimes, it was easier if that someone couldn't argue back. Later, in the tavern, the locals debate the verdict. Some say it's justice, others call it nonsense. The brewer leans over and whispers, "I heard last year a swarm of weevils was banished from a vineyard near Geneva. The priest sprinkled holy water on the rows and told them to find another parish. They did, apparently." He winks. Or maybe it was just a good harvest. You sip your ale, considering. Even nonsense has function. It gave people a sense of control when the world seemed cursed or cruel. One fringe tidbit you hear from a travelling monk. In some Italian towns, animals had public defenders who took their roles very seriously. There's record of one lawyer in 1519 passionately defending rats accused of eating grain. He argued that his clients couldn't attend court because the roads were unsafe due to cats. The judge actually postponed the hearing to give them a fair chance to appear. Bureaucracy meets comedy, centuries before Kafka. The pig's execution, when it happens at sunrise, feels more ceremony than punishment. The hangman wears gloves to avoid moral contamination. The crowd watches in reverent silence as though purging evil itself. You can't decide if it's horrifying or profoundly sad. Afterward, the priest blesses the square and the townspeople disperse. By midday, life continues as if nothing happened. Bread still bakes, bells still ring, and pigs, well, fewer of them now, still snuffle in the mud. You wander toward the fields where shepherds mind their flocks. They speak softly of wolves, not as animals, but as omens. Killing one is considered both heroic and cursed. Some say the wolf's spirit lingers in your dreams, demanding apology. Rules like these thread through every barn and pasture, invisible but binding. Later, at a monastery, a friar tells you about animal blessings, the gentler mirror of animal trials. On St. Anthony's Day, farmers bring their beasts to be sprinkled with holy water, a reminder that creation, too, seeks grace. It's balance, he murmurs. We punish and we bless. The law just tries to keep the scales steady. You think of the pig, the rooster, the rats, all the creatures caught between sin and symbol. Maybe their trials weren't about guilt at all, but about fear that the world, left unchecked, could turn wild again. Historians still argue whether these ceremonies were satire or sincerity, but you, standing here as dusk settles and cows low in the distance, sense a strange poetry in it. For all their absurdity, medieval people were trying to talk to the universe, to make it listen. And as the evening bells echo through the valley, you realize, in a time when law and faith blurred like candle smoke, justice could wear any face, even a pig's. The next morning, your path winds through a quiet lane lined with stone houses and the occasional chicken plotting escape. Ahead rises the town church, massive, cold, and impossibly ornate. The bells toll not for prayer this time, but for collection. Because today, it's not your soul they're after. It's your coins. You step inside and are instantly swallowed by the scent of wax and incense. Candles flicker like fireflies around the altar, and everywhere you look, there's a little box, a plate, or a sign with some variation of "donate here for the remission of sins." Welcome to the Church of Weird Taxes, where salvation comes with a receipt. In medieval Europe, religion wasn't just spiritual, it was economic. The church didn't merely collect faith, it collected fees. Every stage of your life came with a price tag: birth, marriage, confession, burial, need forgiveness. That'll cost you a few silver pennies. Need a shorter stay in purgatory. We can arrange that too. For a fee, naturally. The basic payment was the tithe, 10% of your income, supposedly to support the clergy and the poor. Peasants brought grain, eggs, or lambs instead of cash, lugging their dues to the local tithe barn. Inside, monks tallied everything on wax tablets, while muttering prayers that sounded suspiciously like bookkeeping. You wander into one such barn later in the morning. It smells of hay apples and mild despair. Farmers unload sacks while the collector, a round man with ink, stained fingers, checks his list twice like a holy accountant. "All for God," he says, patting a crate of turnips. "And a little for the bishop's kitchen." Historians still argue whether the tithe system genuinely supported charity or just enriched the upper clergy. Surviving records show both. Some parishes did feed the poor, others funded marble cathedrals and golden chalices that could have fed 10 villages. Then there were the sin fees, officially called penitential fines. Confess you swore at your neighbor, 1 coin. Ate meat on a fast day, 3. Adultery, 7. And public shame. Kill someone by accident. Pay your tariff. Say your prayers, and you're back in grace, so long as you could afford it. You sit on a pew and watch as a woman kneels before a priest, clutching a handful of coins. He blesses her, takes the offering, and marks a ledger. The exchange looks less like absolution and more like banking. To be fair, many clergy believed money could symbolize sacrifice, proof of sincerity, but others saw easy profit. By the 14th century, a new invention made forgiveness even more efficient: indulgences. These were official documents, stamped with seals, promising reduced time in purgatory in exchange for donations. Buy one, and you basically had a spiritual coupon for the afterlife. One fringe story says a German friar once sold indulgences from a traveling cart, decorated with angels painted in gold leaf. He'd shout, "When a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs." Catchy jingle, if morally questionable. Historians still argue whether ordinary people truly believed these papers worked, or just played along out of fear. To the medieval mind, eternity wasn't abstract. It was real estate. You could buy better neighbors in heaven if you paid enough now. Beyond indulgences, there were oblation fees for almost anything sacred. Want your name mentioned in a mass? That's a donation. Want a candle lit for your sick uncle? Another donation. Want a priest to stop ringing the bell at 4 a.m? Probably impossible, but still worth trying with a bribe. You step outside and find a group of merchants grumbling near the market cross. "The abbot's new barn roof cost more than our whole street," one says. "And now he wants a levy for the bell tower." The others nod, faces sour. Rebellion brews here, quietly, under the sound of church chimes. At the same time, the church ran a surprisingly complex financial network. Monasteries lent money, bought land, and managed vineyards. Some abbots were better businessmen than any merchant guildmaster. A few monasteries even offered early versions of safe deposits, lockboxes for valuables in exchange for a small, pious handling fee. And not everyone approved. Reformers like John Wycliffe, and later Martin Luther, would rail against this commercialization of faith, arguing that heaven shouldn't be a pay-to-play arena. But in your medieval stroll, that storm is still centuries away. For now, the system thrives. You make your way into the cloister courtyard, where a monk is tallying sheep with a prayer bead counter. He smiles when he sees your curiosity. "You look like someone who appreciates divine arithmetic," he says. Every soul is a sum waiting for balance. Good deeds add, sins subtract, and penance restores. He raises a brow, but the abbot's ledger must always end in the black. You laugh, though part of you suspects he's not joking. The monk leads you into a scriptorium, where scribes copy donation records onto parchment. Each page gleams with red and gold initials, the artistry almost distracting from the fact that it's an expense report to God. One entry reads, "Received from Thomas the Miller, for relief of purgatorial pain, 2 shillings. The next line adds, "Expended for replacement of broken censer, 2 shillings. A perfect balance indeed." A fringe tidbit from one of the scribes catches your ear. In some parishes, people paid for sin insurance, a kind of prepaid confession. You'd give money in advance for forgiveness of whatever you might do wrong later. It's like medieval moral subscriptions. Miss Church, lose your temper? Steal a sheep. It's already covered. By midday, the town's bell tolls again. Time for the church tax parade. Villagers line up to process their offerings to the abbey. At the front walk the nobles, carrying fine fabrics and silver cups. Behind them shuffle peasants with baskets of onions and chickens. A choir sings, not hymns of mercy, but verses reminding everyone that he who giveth shall enter heaven's gate. You notice the rhyme is suspiciously good marketing. Still, faith isn't absent from this ritual. You see tears, reverence, genuine hope in people's eyes. They believe these offerings matter, that somewhere between heaven and earth, their sacrifice tips the scales of eternity. As the day wanes, the abbot emerges to bless the crowd. His robe glitters with embroidered gold thread. "Your gifts," he proclaims, "will maintain the Lord's house and the poor within it." He pauses. "And perhaps shorten your stay in purgatory." The crowd murmurs a collective amen. You drift away, the chant echoing behind you. The setting sun catches the stained glass, throwing colours across your path. Ruby sapphire, emerald, like shards of holiness scattered on the cobblestones. Historians still argue whether the medieval church's vast wealth corrupted or preserved it. Some say those taxes built beauty, the cathedrals that still owe us today. Others see them as the roots of resentment that would later crack Europe open. But tonight, under the cooling air, you see both sides. You imagine peasants' sweat and bishops' rings, sin coins clinking into boxes, prayers whispered over ledgers. Faith and finance intertwined, as inseparable as candlelight and shadow. You linger a moment longer by the great door, tracing your fingers over the worn carving of an angel holding scales. Maybe the old monk was right. Every soul is a sum waiting for balance. It's just that, in the Middle Ages, someone else always did the math for you. The bell tolls again, but this time the sound carries a tremor. Long, low, mournful. You follow the echoes into the heart of the town, where shutters are drawn tight, and a faint odour of vinegar and smoke lingers in the air. Someone has painted a red cross on a door. Below it, in shaky script, the words, "Lord have mercy." You've arrived in the season of fear, plague etiquette, a time when invisible death rewrote all the rules. The year is something like 1348. The wind carries no birdsong, and people cross themselves at every cough. You step carefully down the narrow lane, boots splashing through puddles of rain and lye. The smell hits you first, a mixture of herbs, sweat, and rot. It clings to everything. A hooded man trudges past with a handcart. The wheels creak. Beneath a ragged cloth lies a shape too still to be sleeping. The man rings a small bell and mutters, "Bring out your dead." The sight freezes you. The rhythm of ordinary life, markets, gossip, laughter, has been replaced by ritualized dread. Even grief follows a schedule now. A friar hurries by, face hidden behind a waxed cloth mask. He clutches a cross and a pouch of salt. Stay indoors after sunset, he warns. Don't breathe near strangers, and for the love of God, burn your bedding. Medieval Europe, once ruled by feast days and fasting, is now governed by quarantine. The rules are strict, improvised, and often bizarre. Towns seal their gates. Travelers are detained for 40 days, a period soon to be known by its Italian name, 40 giorni. If you survive isolation, you're deemed clean. If not, well, there's always the cart. You find refuge in a half-empty tavern, where the innkeeper serves all through a hole in a wooden screen. No offense, he says, just protocol. He wears garlic cloves strung around his neck, today's most fashionable plague deterrent. You order soup, though it tastes faintly of ashes and superstition. Historians still argue whether these household rituals actually helped. Burning herbs, fumigating rooms, carrying posies. Some believe they reduced fleas. Others say they simply gave people something to do in the face of helplessness. You wander out again at dusk. The air glows with bonfires, villagers burning piles of clothes, straw, even cats, believing fire purifies what prayer cannot. At the crossroads, a preacher shouts that the plague is punishment for vanity. Across the square, a barber, surgeon claims it's caused by bad air, and offers to bleed anyone willing to pay. His razor gleams in the firelight. Meanwhile, someone hangs a bunch of herbs, rue, rosemary, and sage, over a door to ward off contagion. A woman sprinkles vinegar on her hands and murmurs charms learned from her grandmother. A child waves a posy under his nose, whispering, Ring o' roses. Though he doesn't know the rhyme, will one day become a ghostly nursery song. You turn down an alley and almost collide with a group of masked figures wearing long black coats and beaked hoods. Their presence sends shivers through the air, plague doctors. The beaks, stuffed with herbs and lavender, are meant to filter miasma or bad air. Their canes serve two purposes, pointing at patients and keeping them at arm's length. One doctor nods as you pass. His voice, muffled behind the mask, says, "Keep to the wind's direction, and avoid the cats. People think they spread it, but truth favors the fleas." You blink. He sounds more modern than the century around him. Historians still argue whether such doctors saved lives or just recorded deaths. But at least they tried. You find yourself near the town's quarantine wall, a crude barrier of stones and fear. Beyond it lie the pest houses, where the sick are confined. You hear coughing, prayers, then silence. Inside, nurses known as watchers risk their lives for a few coins a day, marking time by candles instead of clocks. One fringe tale you overhear in a whisper. A man in Milan bricked himself inside his own house when his wife fell ill. He passed food through a small slit and kept vigil until both starved. When officials found them, they buried the house with stones, sealing it as a warning. The neighbors called it the House of Silence. Inside the walls of cities, new rules bloom like mold. No gatherings, no dancing, no funerals longer than an hour. If you must bury someone, the body goes in a shroud soaked with lime. The priest says the prayer from a distance. No one dares touch the cross afterward. Even courtiers and kings aren't spared. You hear rumors that nobles flee to country estates, quoting Boccaccio's tales of secluded luxury. But isolation doesn't always save them. Death has no respect for silk. You pass through a market square that's become a triage zone. A cart of onions sits untouched. People fear the vendor's wife sneezed that morning. A blacksmith sharpens his own knife in eerie silence, muttering that iron wards off pestilence. Nearby, a young couple trades vows under a balcony, too afraid to meet face to face. In moments like this, humor becomes its own survival. Someone paints graffiti on a wall. If you can read this, you're too close. Another scrolls, "Kiss me, I'm clean." Gallows humor, medieval edition. You duck into a chapel, half expecting the air itself to hum with contagion. Inside, candles flicker before an icon of Saint Roch, patron of plague victims. Pilgrims crawl on their knees to touch the base of the statue, leaving behind small coins and whispered hopes. A priest, hollow-eyed, blesses them with trembling hands. Historians still argue whether Saint Roch actually existed or became a composite of miracles and rumour, but his image, barefoot, with a wound on his thigh, and a loyal dog offering bread, remains everywhere. People crave symbols of mercy more than explanations. You kneel for a moment, not out of piety but awe. The silence in the chapel feels alive, as if faith itself has caught its breath. Outside, the world staggers on. Bells ring not for weddings but for deaths. They toll so often that people start calling them plague music. Whole towns go mute, the sound swallowed by empty streets. And yet, life insists. You see a baker open his stall again, selling, cleansing bread, made with rosemary. Children chase each other with sticks pretending to be doctors. Somewhere, a fiddler plays quietly at dusk, the notes trembling but defiant. By nightfall, you reach the edge of the town wall. A guard lets you pass with a nod, dabbing vinegar on his hands. Beyond the gate, the countryside stretches out. Fields gone wild, cottages shuttered, the stars painfully bright. You breathe in clean air for the first time all day. There's peace out here, but also a haunting loneliness. Rules of quarantine divide not just bodies, but hearts. Lovers separated by walls, families buried apart, priests forbidden to touch the dying. Even compassion must wear gloves now. Historians still argue whether the plague taught Europe hygiene or hysteria. Probably both. But as you stand under the cold sky, one truth glows clear. Fear creates its own order. Out of panic, people invent rituals, some wise, some strange, all trying to keep the darkness from winning. You wrap your cloak tighter and walk on. The wind smells faintly of sage and smoke. Somewhere behind you, a bell tolls again. Not for you, not yet, but close enough to remind you that every breath in this world comes with rules, whispered by survival itself. Morning comes softly after that long, smoky night. The clouds lift, and for the first time in days, the air smells faintly of rain instead of rot. You cross a meadow that once belonged to someone's flock, but the fences are broken and wildflowers have claimed the fields. Civilization feels distant, but you're about to stumble into a place where the rules never really died, the castle of too many laws. Its grey towers rise above the hills, the kind of structure that looks like it taxes your thoughts just for looking at it. Banners flap lazily from the turrets, each bearing a different crest. The lion, the boar, the stag. The drawbridge lowers with a groan, and the guards, helmeted, suspicious, wave you forward after the obligatory sniff for plague air. Inside the courtyard, everything runs on protocol. Servants bow at exactly the right angle, dogs are walked only clockwise, and no one dares whistle before breakfast. It's considered bad luck, and possibly treasonous. You're here to witness the peculiar world of castle etiquette, a labyrinth of manners, punishments, and written laws that make modern workplace policies look like a free for all. The steward greets you, dressed in black velvet and authority. Welcome, he says, to the House of Order. Kindly mind your posture, your tone, and your breathing volume. He pauses. And whatever you do, don't sit before the Lord sits. As you follow him through stone corridors, you realize the castle isn't just a home. It's a machine of hierarchy. Every gesture, every pause, even the direction you look, must obey invisible blueprints of respect. Take dining, for instance. The great hall dazzles with long tables, banners, and silver plates polished to mirror perfection. The Lord's seat, slightly higher than everyone else's, symbolizes the entire feudal universe. You don't speak to him directly unless spoken to. You don't chew loudly. You definitely don't sneeze in the wrong direction. Historians still argue whether these rituals evolved to maintain order, or just to remind everyone of their place. Either way, breaking them had consequences. In one recorded feast, a squire who reached for bread before his superior was sentenced to scrub chamber pots for a month. Another who dared sip wine before the Lord raised his cup was dismissed entirely for presumption of equality. The steward ushers you to the servants' table near the back, where the rules are just as strict, but in the opposite direction. You must eat quickly. Whispers are made, so the plates can be cleared before the next course. And don't look too long at the roasted swan. Someone might think you're coveting it. A jester tumbles by, bells jingling, face painted with forced cheer. "Ah, freedom through foolishness?" he grins. "I'm the only one allowed to mock the Lord's wig." Then he leans close. "But if I make him laugh too hard, I get whipped for insolence." You blink. "So," he adds, "moderate success is safest." After the meal, you wander into the courtyard, where knights practice swordplay. Even here, etiquette rules the blade. Duels follow carefully choreographed honor codes. No striking a man before he salutes. No hitting below the belt. No bloodshed before the herald calls the count. Historians still argue whether chivalry ever truly existed beyond poetry. For every knightly vow of mercy, there's a letter complaining about someone stabbing a rival after the honorable match ended. But the idea mattered. In a world where chaos lurked beyond the moat, rules gave men permission to pretend they were noble, even when they weren't. At the castle gate, a new arrival kneels before the Lord, a tenant seeking justice. His neighbour's pig, he claims, trampled his garden. The steward unfurls a parchment the size of a bedsheet and reads, "By decree of his lordship, all swine trespass shall be compensated in barley, unless the fence be proven faulty, in which case restitution falls to the negligent party." You think about how long that sentence must have taken to write. The tenant just nods, bewildered. The Lord waves a jewelled hand. See it done. And have both men swear upon Saint Hubert's bone to keep peace. One of the weirdest castle laws you over here involves doorways. You must never step through a threshold before someone of higher rank. If you both approach at once, you're expected to perform a brief, polite standoff until one gestures the other forward. This can last awkwardly long. In one fringe story, two barons nearly missed dinner after 20 minutes of mutual bowing. Later, in the solar, a warm chamber for private talk, you meet the lady of the house. Her gown shimmers like liquid gold, and her etiquette is sharper than any sword. You mustn't compliment a woman's hair directly, she explains softly. It implies intimacy. Praise the craftsmanship of her veil instead. She sips wine with deliberate grace. And never turn your back on the Queen's portrait. She may not be here, but she's always watching. You glance at the painting behind her. The Queen's painted eyes indeed seem to follow you. Unsettling. As evening settles, candles glow along the corridors. Servants move like shadows, obeying the curfew bell. No wandering after the ninth toll, unless you're armed or very brave. Nighttime was for spirits and thieves. Breaking curfew could get you thrown in the castle stocks, an uncomfortable wooden frame that turned you into public entertainment until dawn. Historians still argue whether such punishments deterred crime or just kept peasants humble. Either way, they worked, mostly by humiliation. One old rule even allowed villagers to throw rotten vegetables at anyone locked in stocks, provided they aimed below the chin, above the knees, and without mortal force. The steward takes you on a moonlit tour of the law chamber. A room filled with scrolls thicker than tree bark. Each one records a code, decree, or royal whimsy still somehow binding. You spot one titled, Ordinance Concerning Excessive Boots. Another reads, On the Prohibition of Loud Lute Playing During Lent. People need order, the steward says proudly. Without it, we'd be animals. You notice his quill tucked perfectly behind his ear, as if even pen placement has a manual. You ask if anyone ever questions all these rules. He hesitates, sometimes, but rules protect us from chaos. Even foolish ones remind us we belong somewhere. His voice lowers. Though between you and me, I once fined a knight for whistling indoors. The next day he was slain in battle, so now no one whistles at all. The line between superstition and statute here is paper, thin. Before bed, you join the servants in the lower hall. They whisper their own secret customs. Codes for survival beneath the codes. Always bow deeper than the person next to you, says one. Never refuse a toast. And if the Lord drops his spoon, pretend you didn't see it. He'll blame someone anyway. The cook laughs softly. And whatever you do, never criticize the pudding. The last man who did spent 3 nights in the dungeon, reflecting on humility. You sleep that night in a corner of the great hall, wrapped in a borrowed cloak. Above you, the tapestries rustle with unseen drafts, knights frozen mid-battle, saints frozen mid-blessing. Somewhere, the steward's footsteps echo, still inspecting the silence for irregularities. In your dreams, the castle breathes. A living creature made of rituals, swallowing its people whole. You wonder if anyone inside remembers why these rules began, or if they simply continue, because no one dares stop them. Historians still argue whether medieval etiquette served as moral order or social theatre. But from where you lie, beneath the glimmering banners and the weight of invisible expectations, it feels like both. Civilization, after all, is just a performance where everyone forgets their lines, but keeps bowing anyway. Outside, a wolf howls across the hills, free of laws, of titles, of table manners. The sound seeps through the cracks in the walls like a reminder that, beyond the moat, chaos still waits, wild, ungoverned, and hungry for the silence of castles. Morning mist curls around the battlements as you slip out through the castle gate, grateful to breathe unregulated air again. The hills ahead roll wide and green, dotted with wind-warped trees, and the occasional sheep looking mildly philosophical. You follow a dirt road toward a cluster of cottages, where smoke curls from thatched roofs. You've stepped into another realm of strange order, the village of everyday weirdness. Out here, rules aren't written on parchment or enforced by stewards. They live in habit, superstition, and gossip sharper than any sword. The first thing you notice is the shoes. Every doorway has a pair turned upside down. A farmer's wife catches your puzzled look. Keeps witches from borrowing them for flying. She explains matter, of factly, as if it's obvious. Happened last spring to my cousin Agnes. Her best boots went missing, and next morning there were chicken feathers in her chimney. Historians still argue whether such folk practices came from pagan roots or pure practicality. In truth, medieval peasants blurred the line between faith and fear so naturally that no one cared to separate them. If something worked, or even seemed to, it became a rule. Down the lane, a black cat darts across your path. Everyone nearby freezes. Then, in synchronized fashion, they each take 3 backward steps and spit once over the left shoulder. You do the same. Peer pressure is timeless. The local tavern is called the Drowned Rooster, and inside, it's a microcosm of customs. No one drinks from the first jug poured. That's reserved for the household spirits. The owl's frothy and strong enough to dissolve modesty, but you sip carefully. There's an invisible etiquette here. Laugh too soon, and you're arrogant. Stay silent too long, and you're suspicious. A shepherd leans in. "You're not from here," he says, eyes narrowing. "Best learn the sayings quick. Never point at a rainbow. Never sweep after dark. And if you find a coin on the road, leave it. It belongs to the fair folk." You nod solemnly, partly to fit in and partly because his tone suggests non-compliance could be fatal, or at least socially inconvenient. Across the tavern, an old woman is muttering charms over a bowl of milk. "For the butter to come," she says, stirring with a hazel twig. You're told she's the village cunning woman, half healer, half rumor magnet. People bring her everything from broken hearts to broken cart wheels. She has herbs for both. Historians still argue whether these wise women were genuine practitioners of medicine or early victims of patriarchal paranoia. Whatever the truth, their presence kept villages running. When the nearest doctor was a day's ride away, and usually charging more than your entire harvest, folk wisdom filled the gap. You follow her to her cottage, where bundles of dried lavender and sage hang from the rafters. She offers you tea made from nettles and something unidentifiable that smells faintly like wet hay. Good for courage, she says. You look like you'll need some. She's right. Because tonight is charm night, when the villagers perform all their yearly protection rites. The whole place hums with preparation. Brooms laid across thresholds, iron nails hammered above doors, children chased inside before dusk. The air smells of wood smoke and anxiety. At sunset, they gather in the meadow, forming a circle around a bonfire. Everyone holds something personal: a spoon, a lock of hair, a piece of fabric. The cunning woman chants softly, tossing herbs into the flames. Sparks rise like frantic fireflies. For health, she says. For harvest, for hope. Then she pauses, grins, and adds, and for fewer rats in the barley. A fringed tale circulates about a farmer who once skipped charm night, declaring himself too modern for such nonsense. The next week lightning struck his barn 3 times. His sheep allegedly began bleating backwards. You can't verify the story, but no one here has ever missed the ritual since. Later, as the fire dies down, the villagers share bread and ale, their laughter loosening with relief. You realize these customs aren't just superstition, they're community. In a world that offered so little control, every charm and chant was a way to say, we're still here. Back in the cottage, you watch the cunning woman grind herbs under candlelight. See this, she says, holding up a pouch of mint and rosemary. You hang it near your bed to keep nightmares away. She leans closer, whispering, and men who snore. You chuckle, and she winks. Humor is her truest magic. In the morning, you walk through the village square as the church bell tolls. People hurry to market with baskets of eggs, cheese, and gossip. The bailiff stands near the well, announcing new bylaws. No selling bread after noon. No fishing on the Sabbath. No throwing bones at the parson's geese. The villagers nod dutifully, then immediately start discussing how to ignore half of it. Historians still argue whether medieval villages were lawless or self-governing under the radar. In truth, both descriptions fit. Authority existed mainly on paper. Real power was the collective shrug of neighbors, deciding what mattered. A mason points out the maypole, still standing months after the festival. Can't take it down, he says. Bad luck till the cows calve. Then he lowers his voice. Plus, it's the only thing keeping the young lads from boredom. You pause by a well, where ribbons and coins hang from a wooden frame. For wishes, a girl explains shyly. But never ask for love. It twists on you. She drops a pebble and waits for the faint splash. Better to wish for rain. Rain always keeps its promise. The day warms, the kind of soft English sun that never quite burns away the chill. You wander among gardens, where scarecrows wear mismatched clothes and rosaries around their necks. A boy guards a field with a drum, beating it every few minutes to keep spirits sleepy. His rhythm's terrible but enthusiastic. One curious fact you learn over bread and cheese: medieval villagers believed bees could understand human speech. When a beekeeper died, someone had to tell the hives, politely and clearly, or the bees would leave. You picture a solemn procession to the apiary. Dear bees, the master is gone. Please stay. It's strangely touching. As twilight settles, the evening chores begin. The rhythm of another rule-filled night. No spinning after sundown, it tangles fatey. No whistling indoors, it calls ghosts. And if the dogs howl, you're supposed to drop everything and say the Lord's Prayer twice, just in case. But amid all the ritual and folklore, life feels deeply human. People laugh, flirt, argue about cabbage prices, then share their last loaf during a bad harvest. They may believe in witches and luck charms, but they also believe in each other. That might be the strangest rule of all: survive together. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants were crushed by superstition or uplifted by it. Watching them dance barefoot under starlight, you're inclined to think it didn't matter. These odd traditions stitched meaning into long, uncertain days. Without them, the silence between birth and death might have been too heavy to bear. The last thing you hear before sleep is the sound of a lullaby drifting through the dark. Acacias and apples, moonlight and rain, keep all who wander safe again. The melody fades, soft as breath. For a brief moment, even the restless night seems to obey the village's oldest, strangest rule. Be kind enough to let tired souls rest. The dawn greets you with birdsong and a damp chill clinging to the fields. The villagers are already stirring, but your path now curves towards something far more disciplined than superstition or charm. You're heading to the Monastery of Rules, where daily life runs like clockwork. Because clocks were literally invented there. You follow a narrow track through misty woods until stone arches rise ahead, grey and solemn against the morning light. Bells ring in rhythm, not with emotion but precision. The sound isn't calling the faithful to pray so much as commanding the living to synchronize. You step into the courtyard, where a monk in a rough brown habit greets you with a nod but no words. He points to a sign carved in Latin. Silence builds strength. You try a smile, but he simply gestures toward a basin of cold water. Wash, then follow. Inside, everything smells faintly of candle wax, parchment, and boiled vegetables. You've entered a world where time itself is holy and tightly managed. Historians still argue whether monasteries invented modern scheduling or just perfected humanity's obsession with control. Either way, the monks live by the rule of Saint Benedict, a text written centuries earlier that dictates every moment of their day. Wake before dawn, pray, work, eat, pray again, copy manuscripts, tend the gardens, pray once more, sleep, repeat. And you thought your calendar app was strict? You join them for matins, the first service of the day. The chapel glows with candlelight, voices rise and fall in perfect harmony. It's hauntingly beautiful, and just a bit intimidating. No one speaks outside the liturgy. When the bell tolls, all movement halts. You sneeze once, and 50 heads turn as if you've disrupted the laws of physics. After prayers, the monks file silently into the refectory for breakfast. Bowls of barley porridge steam faintly, but no one eats until the abbot gives a small nod. Then spoons move in unison, and the only sound is scraping and chewing. Reading aloud is permitted. One monk recites a passage from scripture, while everyone else pretends not to notice how dry the porridge tastes. You accidentally lift your bowl with the wrong hand, and a novice gently nudges you. Left for offering, right for eating, he whispers. Saint Benedict was quite particular. Outside in the cloister garden, monks tend rows of herbs: rosemary for memory, lavender for calm, wormwood for pest control, and maybe bad moods. The rhythm of their work feels hypnotic. The silence isn't empty, it hums with purpose. A brother named Alred breaks the quiet to explain. Every plant here has meaning. Even the weeds remind us of sins. Persistent, humbling, but never beyond redemption. His voice is soft, like the sound of turning pages. One quirky rule catches your attention: monks must never laugh loudly. Too much mirth, Saint Benedict warned, leads the heart astray. You picture these men trying not to giggle when someone drops a loaf of bread, or when Brother Martin snores through prayers. One fringe tale claims a particularly jolly monk was once ordered to copy the entire Psalter by hand, to meditate upon solemnity. Still, humour sneaks in. At midday, while copying manuscripts, a scribe doodles a tiny snail chasing a knight in the margin. A quiet rebellion preserved for eternity. Historians still argue about those doodles. Were they jokes, warnings, or just creative boredom? Maybe all three. The scriptorium itself is a marvel of discipline. Each monk sits at a desk, quill poised, eyes straining in the dim light. No talking, no sighing, no sneezing too dramatically. Every letter must be perfect, for it's not just writing, it's prayer made ink. You notice one scroll showing an illuminated capital, A, shaped like a dragon swallowing its tail. The artist catches your gaze and smiles faintly. To remind us, he murmurs. That knowledge devours itself if not shared. Then he returns to work, as though the thought never escaped his lips. After a lunch of lentil stew and hard bread, it's time for manual labor hour. You help in the vineyard, learning the sacred choreography of pruning vines, 3 cuts per branch, a small bow of thanks to the earth. The rhythm feels meditative. Sweat and silence mingle into something close to peace, but the monastery's order hides darker corners too. In the chapter house, monks confess small infractions, falling asleep during prayers, whispering during meals, coveting another's cloak. The abbot listens, nods, and assigns penance, extra fasting, or copying psalms by candlelight. It's oddly administrative, a spiritual HR meeting. Historians still argue whether this system created genuine virtue or quiet conformity. Probably both. The monastery kept chaos at bay, but it also caged individuality. Every thought needed permission to breathe. That night, you're invited to the final service. Compline. The chapel glows again, the air thick with incense. The chant is slow, almost hypnotic. Protect us, O Lord, as we stay awake. Watch over us as we sleep. The melody folds around you like warm cloth. When it ends, everyone bows and disperses into silence. Lights go out one by one. Only the moon keeps watch over the cloister arches. You linger, unsure whether you feel peace or claustrophobia. Outside these walls, life is unpredictable, chaotic, cruel. Inside, it's predictable to the point of erasure. Maybe the monks found safety in surrender. Maybe they just ran out of options. Before you leave at dawn, Brother Arid hands you a small scrap of parchment with a single line written in elegant script. Order is not the opposite of freedom. It is what remains when fear is quiet. You tuck it into your pocket, thinking of how easily humans trade spontaneity for structure, confusion for comfort. Maybe we still do. We just call it productivity. Now, as you step back into the sunlight, the bells ring again. This time not as command, but as farewell. Their sound follows you down the hill, fading into wind and birdsong until it's just rhythm without rule. For a fleeting moment, you miss the silence. The road bends east toward the coast, where sea salt crusts the grass and gulls cry like gossiping monks. After so much order, it feels strange to walk without bells dictating your steps. The wind carries freedom, and something else. Smoke. You crest a ridge and see a settlement clustered. By the cliffs, ships bobbing in the harbour, sails half, mended ropes swinging in the breeze. Welcome to the gilded shore, where everything, fishing, shipbuilding, even gossip, is regulated by guild law. You stroll into the market square, where apprentices hammer, tailors shout prices, and bakers argue about flour quality with theological intensity. Each wears a badge on their tunic, a sign of their trade and their belonging. A shoemaker's son couldn't just decide to bake bread one morning. That would violate his guild's charter, and heaven forbid anyone bake without official dough authorization. Historians still argue whether medieval guilds protected workers or strangled innovation. The truth probably lies somewhere between craftsmanship and bureaucracy. A portly man with ink, stained fingers waves you into a workshop, "I'm Master Aldrich," he says, puffing proudly. "Guild scribe and keeper of the rules. All 340. 7 of them." He slaps a parchment thicker than a roast goose. "Would you like to hear Rule 1? You hesitate. It's about honesty in trade," he beams. "Rule 2 is about hammer sizes. Rule 3 forbids whistling while varnish dries. Important, that one. Inside. The smell of sawdust mixes with ale and ambition. Apprentices scurry like mice, carrying planks and paint pots. Each wears a short cord around their neck, a symbol of apprenticeship, and a reminder that they're bound, legally and socially, to obey their masters. One lad whispers to you while planing wood. 3 years I've been sanding boat rails. I dream in splinters now. But next year I'll be a journeyman, free to work anywhere." He pauses. "Well, anywhere that'll sign my license. So, probably here." The guild system ran Europe's trades like a tightly wound clock. Blacksmiths, masons, carpenters, tanners, each had their own hierarchy: apprentice, journeyman, master. Advancement wasn't just about skill. It was about ceremony, fees, and approval. When a craftsman reached mastery, the guild held a feast. He'd present his masterpiece, a single perfect item proving his worth. A chest so finely carved it could shame a cathedral door, a sword balanced like poetry. Historians still argue whether the term masterpiece began as pride or paperwork. At the tavern that evening, laughter rolls like thunder. You sit beside sailors swapping tales about storms, ghosts, and taxes, the unholy trinity of maritime life. A cooper leans close, smelling of tar and triumph. "You know the strangest guild of all," he says. The Rat, catchers of Hammon, had uniforms, oaths, and rat badges made of brass. Claimed they were guardians of the public nose. You snort into your aisle. Guardians of the nose. True as rain, he insists. Even had bylaws about ferret care and trumpet playing. He frowns thoughtfully. Historians still argue whether they were pest control or performance art. Out on the docks, you watch shipwrights at work. They measure planks with ropes, not rulers, chanting rhythmic work songs. Every nail driven has a proper blessing. Hammer 3 times, then mutter. Saint Elmo, steady the hand. You learn that guilds weren't just about work. They were social networks before the word existed. Members helped each other through sickness, funded funerals, even paid ransoms if someone was captured by pirates. In return, you swore loyalty and secrecy. Trade secrets were guarded like royal treasure. One evening, you stumble upon the Night Guild, a gathering of craftsmen who moonlight outside their official orders. Illegal, of course. They meet in an abandoned warehouse by the harbor, oil lamps flickering, air thick with sawdust and defiance. "We experiment," says a weaver with purple, dyed fingers. Different dyes, new patterns. But the guild forbids it. "Too risky," they say, so we work in shadows. On a table nearby lies a tapestry unlike anything you've seen, woven in spirals, studded with shells that shimmer in lamplight. For beauty, she whispers, not just for rules. Historians still argue whether such secret societies were acts of rebellion or early steps toward art for art's sake. You decide it doesn't matter. The tapestry glows like freedom. A few days later, the town hosts its grand guild festival. Banners unfurl, trumpets blare, and every trade parades its best work through the streets. The bakers toss loaves into the crowd. The masons carry miniature towers. The blacksmiths clang in rhythm, like a metallic choir. The highlight comes when the guild court convenes. A mock trial where craftsmen debate crimes of workmanship. This year's case, a cooper accused of making barrels too round, thereby embarrassing his peers. The judge, wearing a wig made of feathers, don't ask, listens gravely. The verdict, guilty of excellence. Sentence: free beer for everyone. You can't help laughing. The crowd roars approval. The air tastes of roast meat, sawdust, and mild anarchy. Later, in a quieter corner, you meet a young woman selling candles shaped like saints. She explains that her mother was banned from the official candle makers guild for being improperly gendered for commerce. Now she works alone, smuggling her candles into markets under the guise of holy offerings. Her smile is sharp. If the rules won't change, she says, you learn to sell in shadows. Historians still argue whether guilds empowered craftsmen or suppressed outsiders. For every brotherhood that nurtured skill, there was a gatekeeping clique that feared change. Yet somehow, amid the red tape and ritual, beauty endured. That night, the festival ends with fireworks, tiny rockets launched from the docks, sparking against the Black Sea. People cheer, mugs clink, and even the harbour rats seem impressed. You sit on a barrel, feet dangling over the water, thinking of how humans crave structure, yet secretly adore breaking it. Behind you, the guild hall glows, its stained glass windows depicting saints, hammers, and compasses. Inside, somewhere Master Aldrich is probably updating Rule 348. No fireworks within 50 yards of carpentry. The sea wind sighs through the ropes, carrying echoes of laughter and rules rewritten in the salt air. Morning mist curls low along the riverbank as you leave the busy harbour behind. The road winds through damp meadows dotted with huts where thin smoke drifts from crooked chimneys. A faint metallic tang lingers in the air. Iron, herbs, and something vaguely unsettling. Ahead, a crude wooden sign sways in the breeze. Physic and Cures, Master Theobald. Licensed by grace of gods, mostly. You follow the smell of boiled cabbage and curiosity. Inside, the clinic resembles a chaotic kitchen. Bundles of dried plants hang from rafters like upside down bats, and jars filled with cloudy liquids clutter every shelf. On the table lies an open anatomy chart that looks suspiciously like it was drawn by someone who'd never actually seen a human skeleton. A rotund man with spectacles perched on his forehead waves you in.
Ah! Another pilgrim of wellness!
He booms. Tell me, do you feel an imbalance of humours, or are you simply melancholic for attention? You try not to smile. Bit of both, maybe. Excellent, he says, clapping his hands.
Then we shall bleed you moderately?
Too much health breeds arrogance. Welcome to the strange, sincere, and occasionally terrifying world of medieval medicine. A realm where barbers' razors doubled as surgical tools and astrology decided when to sneeze safely. Historians still argue whether the four humor theory, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, was pseudoscience or the best framework available before microscopes. Either way, it gave doctors something to say while looking important. Master Theobald picks up a leech jar. Inside, the creatures wreather like licorice come alive. Marvels of nature, he whispers reverently. They balance what cannot be seen. You lean closer, half horrified, half fascinated. He gestures to your wrist. You seem choleric. Too much heat. Too much motion. A few minutes with my most cooperative leeches, and you shall feel positively medieval. You decline politely, feigning sudden equilibrium. Instead, you wander through his apothecary shelves. There's powdered unicorn horns, really chalk, ground emerald, definitely sand, and a jar labelled mummy dust, premium. Theobald notices your raised eyebrow.
Genuine Egyptian!
He insists. Or at least very old. Helps with headaches and theological confusion. Historians still argue whether people truly ingested powdered mummies, or if merchants just found a grisly marketing trick. Either way, trade in mumia flourished for centuries. Nothing says health like ancient farro in your tea. As you leave the apothecary, you stumble upon a woman setting herbs to dry on her doorstep. Her sleeves are rolled high, her hands stained green. She smiles knowingly before you even speak. You went to Theobald, didn't you? You nod. He cures what he causes, she says wryly. Come here, I'll show you the real medicine. Her name is Brunhild, a village healer. Not licensed, not literate, but deeply trusted. Her cottage smells of sage and wood smoke, and every surface holds bottles filled with sunlight, tinted oils. My grandmother taught me this craft, she says. We'll heal what we can and comfort what we can't. She hands you a cup of steaming brew. It tastes like mint and dirt, but somehow it warms your bones. Brunhild's remedies include willow bark for pain, garlic for infections, and honey for wounds. Things that actually work, though no one in power will admit it yet. They call us witches, she says softly, because our medicine doesn't bleed you dry. Historians still argue whether midwives and herbalists were feared for their skill or their independence. Probably both. Outside, thunder rumbles. A storm approaches and villagers hurry to shutter windows. You notice charms nailed above every door, twisted iron, sprigs of rosemary, bits of parchment scribbled with Latin that even priests can't read. Disease and evil are equally invisible. So why not defend against both? When lightning flashes, a priest hurries down the road clutching a relic. A finger bone in a glass tube.
For protection!
He shouts. The saints ward off pestilence. You can't help wondering if the bone's previous owner agrees. Later, you follow the priest to a small church where candles flicker before crude paintings of miracles. One shows Saint Roch lifting his tunic to display his plague sore. Patron saint of people having a worse day than you. Inside, villagers kneel and whisper prayers for health. The air smells of wax fear and faint hope. A boy coughs behind you, and everyone subtly leans away. Some things never change. A monk approaches, robes brushing the floor. Faith is the greatest medicine, he murmurs. But herbs help, too. He opens his sleeve to reveal a pouch of dried lavender and wormwood. We prepare these in secret. Officially, prayer must suffice. But God made plants, did he not? Historians still argue whether monasteries preserved medicine or hindered it with theology. Yet their infirmaries recorded symptoms, treatments, and experiments centuries before universities existed. You travel next to a university town, its streets crowded with scholars in robes that look like they were designed by someone allergic to comfort. At the gate, you overhear a lecture spilling from an open window. Remember, gentlemen, a professor declares, the stars govern not only our fates but our phlegm. The students dutifully take notes while eyeing the tavern across the square. The professor rolls out a chart showing planets and organs. Mars rules the liver, Venus the kidneys, the moon the brain, which explains a lot. Historians still argue whether astrology guided real healing or was just poetic guesswork. But even skeptics agree that early astronomers emerged from these same astrologers, proving that bad predictions can still lead to progress. You pause at a stall where a barber advertises bloodletting, tooth pulling, and haircuts. Discount for all three. The barber's pole twirls red and white, its stripes symbolizing bandages and blood. One stop for beauty and balance. He boasts, brandishing a razor that's seen too many stories. Inside his tent, you spot a patient gripping a bucket while the barber hums cheerfully. Don't worry, he says. I've done this since breakfast. You retreat swiftly, deciding you quite like your blood where it is. That evening, in a smoky inn, travellers share their healing tales. One knight swears by crushed emeralds for snakebite, another by frog hearts for courage. A weary mother nods toward her sleeping child. He survived fever once, she whispers. I prayed, burned rosemary, and promised Saint Blaise I'd never curse again. I kept 2 out of 3. You sip bowl that tastes faintly of medicine itself, brewed with herbs once believed to purify the blood. The tavern keeper winks. Health in a mug, he says. Guaranteed to improve your mood if nothing else. Laughter rolls through the room, soft and grateful. You realize that beneath the superstition, the potions, and the wild guesses, medieval medicine had one thing right: belief matters. Whether in God, herbs, or humor, healing begins where fear ends. As you walk back through moonlit streets, you pass a sickroom window glowing faintly. Inside, a mother hums while sponging her son's forehead with lavender water. Outside, Theobald the apothecary mutters about balancing humours. Brunhald crushes herbs in silence, and the stars, those ancient, indifferent healers, blink patiently above them all. You smile. Maybe the real cure was always the comfort of trying. You rise with the pale light of dawn, the air cool and forgiving, after so many strange centuries. The cobbled road stretches ahead, wet with dew, and in the distance, church bells toll, not for curfew or confession this time, but for change. The old order of rules, rituals, and rigid hierarchies is cracking like frost under spring's first sun. You pass a village green where children chase one another, their laughter bright against the hum of awakening life. Once, these same fields were patrolled by wardens checking hemlines or enforcing meatless days. Now, people trade smiles instead of fines. The world is learning to breathe again. A merchant cart rattles by, loaded with printed pamphlets, tiny revolutions bound in cheap paper.
Fresh ideas from Florence!
The driver calls.
Philosophy, anatomy, astronomy. Get your enlightenment right here.
He winks as he tosses one your way. The pamphlet smells of ink and possibility. It shows diagrams of the human body drawn with reverence, not fear. Muscles, veins, organs, all mapped as wonders rather than moral tests. The old belief that illness meant sin begins to fade in these pages. Observation over obedience. One line reads. You mouth it softly, feeling how radical those two words once were. Historians still argue whether the Renaissance freed minds or simply rebranded ambition, but you can feel the shift in the air. Knowledge is no longer guarded by guilds or monasteries. It's printing itself into every curious hand. You wander through a town square bustling with new freedoms, disguised as old habits. A tailor sells patterned silks that would have been illegal under sumptuary laws. A brewer advertises, "Al for all, no license required." Even the baker dares to shape loaves like hearts instead of state-approved rectangles. There's mischief in the air, the good kind. People talk, argue, laugh too loudly. The marketplace no longer smells of punishment, but of fresh bread and optimism. You spot a plaque where the pillory once stood. Here, once, silence was sold for obedience. Now, noise is welcome. You smile. That's progress, messy and magnificent. Further along the road, you find an old knight polishing his rusted armor. He waves you over, chuckling. "Can't bring myself to throw it out," he says. "Spent years learning the code of chivalry. Turns out, decency works better without a sword." He lifts the visor, his face creased with good humor. "They tell me we have new rules now. Laws, they call them. Ones that don't need quests or kings." You sit beside him, and for a moment the past and present feel like two sides of the same coin. Humanity keeps inventing codes. Chivalric, religious, bureaucratic, each meant to keep chaos at bay. Maybe the trick is learning when to follow them, and when to finally let them go. A scholar nearby reads aloud from a new book. Galileo, he says, or maybe Descartes. The ideas are strange and electric the earth moves. Thought itself is proof. Doubt can be divine. You realize that medieval fear of heresy has slowly been replaced by curiosity. The whispering candlelight of monasteries has become the blazing daylight of reason. And yet, you can't quite sneer at the old world. Its people, muddy, anxious, devout, kept the fragile flame of survival alive through pestilence and paranoia. Their rules, however absurd, came from the same human longing to understand, to protect, to belong. You think of the monk's silent devotion, the healer's quiet defiance, the guildsman's stubborn pride. All flawed, all necessary. Historians still argue whether the Middle Ages were dark or just dimly lit. But you've walked those shadowed roads, smelled the smoke of plague fires, felt the weight of bells, that ruled every hour. You know that under all that control pulsed the first heartbeat of modern life. You reach a small inn as evening settles. A young woman sits by the hearth, reading aloud from a book. Imagine that, reading for pleasure. Her voice dances over words like liberty and reason. Outside, rain patters softly, a rhythm older than any law. You sit back, close your eyes, and realize the weird medieval rules weren't madness. They were scaffolding for survival. They gave structure to chaos, comfort to fear, even the strangest customs. Trial by water, curfew bells, leech jars, were desperate acts of meaning, making in a world that rarely made sense. And maybe we're still doing the same thing today, just with better lighting and fewer rodents. A cat curls beside the fire, purring, untaxed, untrade, unapologetically alive. You scratch its ear and whisper, "We made it." Outside, lightning flashes far off over the hills, illuminating fields where once peasants labored under lords. The thunder that follows sounds less like warning and more like applause. The innkeeper pours you a mug of ale and nods toward the window. "Strange times. He says. "Old rules gone, new ones coming." But the sun still rises. You lift your drink in quiet agreement. The night hums, alive with possibility. Wind down, 300 words. Now the road grows softer underfoot. The lanterns blur in the drizzle, their halos shimmering like dreams. You can hear the quiet breath of the countryside settling for the night. The distant hoot of an owl, the sigh of wind through half bare trees. The world, once ruled by bells and decrees, has learned to whisper again. You walk slower, your steps sensing with the rhythm of your own heartbeat. The heavy air of history, smoke, incense, sweat, and candlelight, fades into something gentle and clean. The echoes of curfews, oaths, and prayers dissolve like ripples on a calm pond. What remains is simple human rhythm: inhale, exhale, rest. You picture the faces you've met along the way. The monk with ink, stained fingers, the healer with her herbs, the laughing guildsman, the child chasing freedom through the square. All of them ghosts now, but kind ghosts, lingering not to haunt you, but to remind you. Every rule ever written began as a wish to make life better, even the strangest ones. You find a patch of dry grass, stretch out, and let your eyes drift toward the stars. They look the same as they did to those medieval dreamers who once mapped their faith onto the night sky. Maybe that's the real continuity, the endless curiosity glowing in darkness. A soft breeze brushes your face, carrying the faintest scent of lavender and old parchment. You smile, half asleep, grateful for how far you've traveled through time and thought. The bells are silent now. The world is quiet.